So we are approaching the last session before the conclusion of this very exciting and loaded day. We all have many things to say that you couldn't say, many ramifications. I'm Michal Govrin, and I have the honor to present as this first lecturer Dr. Keren Omry. Keren Omry is Assistant Professor of American Studies in the University of Haifa. Her research, writing, and teaching focus on theorizing the contemporary with particular reference to popular culture. This includes work on posthumanism and science fiction, post 9/11, aesthetics, and jazz and African American literature. Her topic will be novels of the contemporary, responsibility, subjectivity, and possibility.
So thank you, Michal, and thank you to Yochi and to Omry and to Renana and to Adam and to everyone who organized this and for staying and for your intellectual generosity. I mean, this is a rare privilege, and I'm really, really delighted to be part of this. And I'll also start by saying that after today, this is the kind of advantage and the disadvantage of being the final speaker. I have so many new things I want to say and to change, but I won't. So, because I won't have time. So just I have a lot of thought bubbles, you can imagine. Now, the letter of introduction invited us to consider what it means to be just in the context of contemporary conflicts. And by contemporary conflicts is meant those intractable, interminable, and violent disputes on one hand, that are contemporary only insofar as they've been going on for so long, and the changing nature of conflict on the other, that takes as its agents extranationals, economic sanctions, and our quasi-autonomous technologies. Put differently, we might say that these contemporary conflicts are both fundamentally human, historical and bound to all of human history, and transcendently post-human, questioning the very role of the subject within the conflict. And this question of who is the subject, is it the citizen, the prime minister, the pilot, the programmer, the victim, the clerk, the reporter, the corporation, the policy, the idea, and so on. And this question I found really interestingly pervasive in, I think, every single one of the texts that were pre-circulated, kind of the negotiations, the collective and the individual for the subject position. Tying these questions with the notion of justice further grounds the debate in the realm of the human, or, of course, the divine, but I'm not going to go into divine justice today. Now, to be perfectly frank, and I've said this to some in kind of informal conversations, even though I'm an advocate of fairness, I really despise the valuation of justice. And I might not be in the right place to be saying this, but I think that in all too many ways, justice is what got us into this mess, and I see no way for it to get us out. I don't know how to measure justice. I don't know how to quantify it, or indeed even how to define it, even though we saw some tables and some numbers, and we've heard some precedents and whatnot. It's not enough for me. Surely for justice, if it is to be a guiding beacon, some ultimate end goal, it must fall within some universalizing principle. It must be some notion of an absolute. If not, then it becomes inevitably and irredeemably impossible. At best, it can be approximated, for justice is political, it is subjective, it is costly, it is beautiful, and it is always deferred. I mean, Galile's not here, but I think this has to do with something that he was talking about. It's constantly and perpetually postponed. And yet we want it, we seek it, indeed we demand it. Now, I'll get to the bottom line now, because I might run out of time, so just so you know where I'm going with this. I believe, or I argue, that narratives of accountability without blame or shame, but with responsibility, begin to offer a practice of justice, even if not yet its ideal. Okay, so that's where I'm heading. And so, as I said, I'm putting aside divine justice. I choose to stick with the human as a subject, which will enable me in a few minutes to get to the aesthetic, which is a place I'm much more comfortable. As we read and we heard and we know, Judith Butler, among other scholars, dispels the sanctity of the human as a whole, dissolving the body into a site of ongoing discourse, penetrations, citations, and extrapolations. Moreover, from our readings of Cohabitant, as we heard last night, we get to the notion of the cohabitant. And even though that notion was dismantled yesterday in very powerful ways, maybe we can still redeem it. The cohabitant, that is a subject position that is never individualized, but always already interdependent with an other. And it is on this twinned impulse that I wish to focus. Inwards, with the individual who is fragmented, penetrated, interpreted through ongoing discourse, and outward, as we are part and parcel of an other, what Ruth, a novelist I work on as well, is called the interbeing. Now, this latter notion, gaining traction in American studies and elsewhere, is being interpreted here as both related to the subject and to larger categories of community as the transnational. Right? This has to do with the internationalism we heard before. Transnational, which outlines a global link between power, nation, and narrative. So a lot of these ideas I'm thinking simultaneously about the individual and about the larger constructs. Thus, if we accept as our premise that the underlying core of justice is the human subject, plural, dynamic, post-human, whatever it is, but nevertheless based on some notion of a human, and if we agree, which I presumptuously claim is logically necessary, that the primary methodology of justice is not universal principle, but in fact storytelling, as in which side tells which story and who is more convincing, and where, and when, and to whom, and so on. And why, right, Carol? Are we asked to tell the story, or do we get free lunch for it, and so on? So if we agree, as I am imposing an agreement upon you, that justice is based on storytelling, then we've arrived at the aesthetic. In fact, at the literary. Being a reader and a scholar of the novel form, more than any other forms of literature on one hand, and of the contemporary on the other, binds me, however, to an ongoing irony. We all know that the novel emerges alongside the formalization of both the modern nation-state and of the individual, right? We know where the novel comes from, the Western contemporary novel, and what forces it accompanies. And so one of the main questions that guides my current research asks whether and how might contemporary novels reflect some of these basic fundamental shifts that we've described. One proposition is that there is increasingly, if subtly, a shift from justice to responsibility, possibly decency, and I like this shift. I think we can do something good with responsibility, and my project seeks to examine how these novels articulate accountability, and thus really reposition our past, reconfigure our present, and reimagine our futures. In my current research, I adopt the terror attacks of 9/11 and their aftermath as standing metonymically for the kinds of changes that I've described. Now let me say here that this is not a claim that these events changed US literature or even US policy. However, they are perceived culturally and politically as a definitive turning point that concentrated the various impulses that have moved us into the 21st century. As such, the post-9/11 US novel seeks to recontextualize American values and American rhetoric, and has been proclaimed to reflect the culture of post-trauma America, demonstrating a snowballing crisis of identity which these falling towers set in motion. Now, for some scholars, this presents an opportunity, even perhaps an obligation, as writers are in a unique position to explore the tense polarities of contemporary national debate, and thus to dramatize the contradictions, but also the possibilities that emerge from these tensions. And yet, literary scholars lament what they've seen broadly as a failure to formalize this shift structurally in the novels, which have too often resorted to an intense, introspective, and personalized exploration of grief and loss. And here then I'm thinking of the novel you discussed, and which I confess again I haven't read in its entirety, but seems to be a distillation of this personal grief and loss, whether or not we want to metaphorize it as part of the national story. And so for some of these critics, that this is a failure of many of the novels that have come after 9/11. In contrast, we see the potential to resolve the current collapse in literature of the public domain imposed by the terrorist attacks. Right? Let me just finish that sentence. the collapse of literature, of the public domain with a fundamentally domestic and hyper-individualized narrative is being produced since the attacks. That is, we see with the terror attacks of 9/11, 2001, the personal has become not simply public but political, right? It's, I'm thinking of the biographies that were published and this very public exploration of grief. You've got the monuments and so on. And yet it's first and foremost personal in many ways. But the suggestion is to move instead to what Michael Rothberg and others have called a fiction of international relations and extraterritorial citizenship. Okay, so this is not the abandonment or even really the expansion of that circle of loyalty that we read about, or even the narrative of accountability, which I'm invoking. But it is a suggestion of a temporal and a spatial fluidity, which I think we're beginning to see in some of these narratives. Now, in the article that I asked to be circulated, that you may or may not have had a chance to look at, I've selected two texts which I feel begin to move us out of the paralysis of post-trauma and gradually moving from blame, loss, or pain to accountability and thus to recountability. One way this is done is through a form of American transnationalism, which really proposes a kind of disinterpolation. That is, to extricate ourselves from the predetermined ideological webs is to move from a set of relations, to decontextualize spatially and temporally from existing defining ideologies. Now, this decontextualization in the novels is, for me, the key, because they remove us from this teleology of blame to justice, which I have indicated I find problematic. Now, the article I sent is a few years old now, but it's what got me into this. And I think it still does a decent job of raising the questions and seeing how contemporary texts move away from the stasis of stable categories, away from the predetermined restrictions of the novel form. And so in addition to what else they accomplish, and they do a lot, I value these novels in that they both constantly signal a metaleptic awareness of their own role as novels, as literary constructs which reflect the shifting categories of the nation and of the individual, and point to a pressing recognition that the stories of the nation and of origin must be retold. In other words, as we read these novels, we never forget that we're reading a novel. They're very constructed, very aestheticized texts that take on the tropes of literary use as part of their own narrative. Now, the essay, or the article, attempts to demonstrate Morrison's use of the trope of literature as a key to freedom in her 2008 Mercy, a novel that is fundamentally about enslavement. And she does, or I have done this, by critically juxtaposing it with Nailo Hopkinson's earlier novel, The Salt Roads, from 2003. Now, if you know these texts, or if you read the article, you'll know that these are not straightforward 9/11 texts in any way. For me, I find this precisely the reason why they are much more effective and much more productive a ground of analysis to think of the post-9/11 moment. You inevitably, after these attacks, have a plethora of novels that write about where I was when the towers fell and what happened to me afterwards and so on and so forth. And I find those, again, inevitable but limited fictionally. Now, these two very different stories with different storytellers, different impulses, different styles and so on. Nevertheless, the two novels, the two writers turn to similar motifs, that is, into the makings of a nation, a community, and a family in a world defined by chaos. Each of the novels revisits the past, and they recreate moments of origin in order to make sense of the patterns of contemporary culture and politics. Both novels effectively trace the roots of Judeo-Christian mythology and contemporary Western culture across vast swaths of land, through the bodies of women, and by means of language and of literature. Now, elsewhere, in a 2009 article, Morrison writes of two common human reactions to the perception of chaos. And these terror attacks very much create this culture of chaos, right? Everything has broken apart. We don't know how to pull ourselves together. And these two strategies are naming, kind of categorizing this lack of order in a way that creates a new order, and violence, simply responding violently in order to try and control this chaos. But Morrison proposes a third strategy, and that is art. Both writers identify the body of literature as that matter, both physical and permeable, that will ground the narratives are present responsibly and beautifully. Now, Mercy embodies this possibility, turning to writing as the only chance for redemption and finally for freedom, left open by the end. Morrison proposes a new story of beginnings in which a nation is built and a new Adam emerges into a virginal land. Typically, however, and importantly for our purposes, Morrison is not suggesting the innocence of Eden. She's not suggesting that we go back to this paradise of innocence, which is clearly impossible to any contemporary reader, certainly post 9/11 in the United States. But instead she explores the seductions and the perils of human nature. First love becomes fear of love. Mother hunger begins to devour as families crumble in a world of orphans. A friendship as of equals becomes crippling loneliness, and the promise of the American dream turns rancid with greed. So if you know the novel, then you'll know that at the final scenes of the text, we have our protagonist who is alone in an empty house, really the kind of the edifice of the American dream, this mansion of American possibility, and she's writing, she's etching her story. She's barely literate, and she's etching her story with a rusted nail. And in retrospect, we realize that this is the narrative that we have probably been reading. Okay, so kind of both the literacy and the rust, right, the corrosion of the American dream becomes physically present in the novel through storytelling. Now, while the three principal settings of the Hopkinson earlier text rest outside the United States, they serve to lay the groundwork for a fundamentally American tale of individuation, of nation building, immigration, and global colonialism. This notwithstanding, through a meticulous intertwining of three utterly distinct narrative arcs, Hopkinson challenges some of the presumptions of both the American individual and of the nation state. All three women, right, again, if you didn't get a chance, I'll just give you kind of highlights. It's three different storylines. One takes place in Egypt and Jerusalem of the Roman Empire. A second storyline takes place in the sugar plantations of 17th century Santo Domingo. And the third storyline in the 19th century with Jean Duval, who's the Creole lover of Charles Baudelaire, right? So these are the three very, very different narrative strands. Each of the protagonists, each of these women are distinctly non-hegemonic, populate non-hegemonic positions, okay, which I think is relevant for our purpose. Now, just let me find my place. Through a meticulous intertwining of these distinct narratives, Hopkinson challenges some of the presumptions of the American novel. All three women inhabiting these non-hegemonic social functions are, we discover, bound together through a fourth narrative arc, a fantastical figure of Azili, a spirit in search of a body throughout time and across space. Okay, so this is a spirit force who kind of pops in and out of the different narratives and literally possesses these women in different ways. And so what we have in both of these novels is an investigation really into the kind of cohabitation that Butler maps out for us. Both authors play on expectations of the American story, together with its assumptions of manifest destiny and states of exception, proven by the nation's success, and thus show the damning effects of justice. They offer instead, the novels that is, possibilities opened by responsibility and recountability. Neither the nation nor the subject can maintain any stability or wholeness in these novels, and it is only through the permeability and narrativability of each that we can hope to stabilize a future present. Now, the problems with justice and the impulse to achieve it, the imperative of accountability and its effect on the subject position, interbeings and individuals, and the reflections of these issues in the persistently powerful structure of the novel are all paramount today in a time in which we're seeing in the news every day overcompensation in the name of justice that eliminates accountability, right? So buildings named after Jefferson, right? The whole issue, should we take off the name because he was a slaveholder? Well, we're going to ignore a lot of our past if we do that. It's a time in which Huckleberry Finn is being banned again. I don't know if you heard this, because some of the students feel uncomfortable with some of the language. When refugees are shaking to the foundation any understanding of a circle of loyalty, and when the privilege of taking offense has so paralyzed any genuine debate of the kind that hopefully we are pursuing here. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keren, for bringing us back to the novels and for keeping up with the structure of time in a marvelous way. Reading your paper, it brought me back to the next day to 9/11 when I happened to come into Manhattan, and the weeks later, and the fire coming up constantly, shaking something very deep into the American psyche. And the street was silent, and people were gathering as a mob together, and there was a false alarm in Bryant Park that all the people ran to one side. So you could feel how a society is really shaken by something that did not have any discourse to speak about. And as you mentioned in your article, Don DeLillo, and this incredible image of his post-9/11 novel, The Falling Man, of the man who walks on the rope and no structure under. So the role of literature to propose maybe some salvation, as he has in The Angel and Esmeralda, or suddenly on a bill, how do you call it?
Billboard.
Billboard. The orange juice looks like an angel, and people stand there and worship that. And a week later, and 2 days later, there are already the stands that sell souvenirs, and everything is commercialized. So on one hand, but on the other hand, to keep the open question in such a way where narrative can do that, and maybe question even justice. So I open it to the
Don't you think we should have because we're running out of time, don't you think we should take 2 talks and then do discussion?
Okay, I agree to that comment about the... So would you like to stay in your place, Ruth, or you want to...
I'm fine here.
Okay.
I'm not going to be in the interest of time.
Let me introduce you. Professor Ruth Starkman. Ruth Starkman teaches biomedical and computer ethics at Stanford University. She writes on justice and privacy for students, veterans, patients, and families. Ruth, please. Ethics and privacy.
Okay. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the Leer Institute. Thank you, Leer. If you don't mind, can you put the microphone? Okay.
You can just move that.
Just move it.
Yeah.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here, and I will try to make this interesting and short for you. I'm a philosopher, and I teach mostly now in a computer science department, and my biggest dilemma is, after 9/11, is trying to teach my students about ethics, justice, privacy in a world of surveillance, and trying to pick philosophical texts that help us understand or give us a framework for finding some sort of concept of justice in a 9/11 world where we're constantly under surveillance. 9/11 isn't any 9/11 fundamentally changed surveillance, largely for digital reasons, also for some legal reasons, but surveillance has a very, very long history in the United States, and it differs in the Israeli context. But for this context, I wanted to talk about Hannah Arendt, which I choose for my students because she has a number of different positions. My challenge is that I have students who are going out into jobs at 21 years old, making $200,000 a year, and they're mantra in Silicon Valley is, if you're not cheating, you're not trying hard enough. And so this is the world they're going to. Will they hear? Will it matter to them? What will they be whistleblowers when they go to Palantir and they see that these data mining companies have channels where they watch things and they make bulk collections? What will they do, and what tools can I give them to read? And the answer is, all the tools I have are blunt instruments, and they're imperfect. So I picked an imperfect one. I picked Hannah Arendt on education, and she's difficult. She's never the same Arendt, depending on which one you're reading. She has one notion of justice that Russell Berman talked about last night, which is justice can be found only in that long dead but still legitimate institution of the nation state, which protects our citizenship. She also has a Heideggerian notion of justice, which is in caring for the world. And in this essay, she has a notion of justice, which she gets from Kant, and Kant's notion of the division, the separation of private and public, and his notion that education is the private sphere. And she makes an argument that is very unpopular, that we need to keep students in the private sphere as long as they are unmündig, they're not ready. And that private sphere, preserving that is just both in the Kantian sense and in the Heideggerian sense, because in preserving the private sphere for students, we allow them to become the people who can preserve the world that we live in. And this is how she ends the essay. She has all kinds of wild and strange assumptions in the essay. It's problematic. It's as problematic as her Little Rock essay. She defends authority, as she has elsewhere, and she defends the Socratic interpretation that you really need to need to. My question that I leave you with this essay is, how helpful are her notions? How helpful is her notion of privacy? She wants us to believe that privacy, that the essence of humanity can only evolve in darkness, and that we need this dark, private place, and it's based on a dwelling. It's based on property, private property, and that we need to have this private space away from the world in order to actually become the fully shaped citizens that can go out into the public sphere and change the world. And she needs that world to be preserved. And my question for my students is, does this even exist? Is this a fantasy of hers? Has digital communication completely killed this? Does it matter? Does preserving privacy really lead to the kind of Heideggerian and Kantian justice that she thinks it will? And those are my questions about the piece.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ruth, and it opens really the floor for an open question. I mean, Yona would be happy about this talk, and I open the question to the floor.
Thank you, both of you. I think that reaching this point, as planned, of course, from the beginning, but reaching this point of the 9/11 at the end, and I think 9/11, in a way, hasn't been conceptualized enough within Israeli society or Israeli culture, because we have our own traumas, and 9/11, of course, is part of, the what was the term, Carol? The cosmopolitan suffering, yeah. So 9/11 is there definitely, but it hasn't been conceptualized enough in Israel. Now that I think of it, the fact that the post-Oslo turn also somehow maps on the post-9/11. For me, it's interesting to think about it. I don't have anything yet to say about it, but it's interesting for me to see how both of you, in a way, retreated in the post-9/11 reality to this stuff, not you, the text that you're dealing with. You chose text that retreat to the private in order to regroup and march outside better or stronger. I mean, if it's you invoking Arendt in a post-9/11 reality, or you looking at texts that, as you say, do not speak of 9/11 reality directly, but you read it as such. And what is this place, if at all it exists? So you invoke fantasy in a way. We need fantasy in order to recreate this privacy. You're saying maybe it's a fantasy. Do we have this privacy in post 9/11, in the digital era? It's not necessarily post 9/11. And I wonder if you can connect that in a way. I mean, where is the private located, and why is it so important for us to go back to it, to this dark, safe place or not safe?
Shall we go with a few questions, or do you want to answer it?
I'd rather answer, otherwise I'm afraid I'll forget. In fact, what I try to talk about is the texts that don't resort back to the private. One of the things that some of these critics are saying about the post-9/11 novel is that they fail to do anything productive, as in move us out of this dark space, because they're so focused on the internal, the introspective. And there are lots of novels that do this. So the Jonathan Safran Foer's Extremely Loud and whatever. Yes. My mind, I have a condition that excuses me from remembering. The Dr. Lillo, The Falling Land, right? There are many, many texts that really kind of turn inwards and stay static. So at the end of Falling Man, you have, if you remember the novel, he's stuck in that no space, right? And he's literally stuck playing at chances, right? Playing gambling. I think texts like the Morrison and the Hopkinson, and I'm reading now The Zero by someone, are texts that move, texts that try to move productively out of the personal pain, because the pain leads to blame, leads to maybe catharsis, possibly, but that's where they end. And I think the novel can do so much more. And I mean, I know why you said fantasy, but I try to stay away from that. So I mean, I look at a lot of alternate histories and a lot of texts that play with timelines. And I mean, again, I found your talk so interesting because you went from the one Goldsman novel to the Falling Out of Time, is it called? Right, in which you say that he moves away from that teleological narrative, and I think that's exactly what some of these texts are trying to do. So kind of reposition the private in a new way, maybe because we no longer have privacy.
But private and personal do not necessarily overlap. I mean,
Well, they overlap, they're maybe not necessarily the same.
okay, they're not necessarily the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
For Arendt, the private is a philosophical category.
exactly.
It's a philosophical category where one has one's origins, one starts, one has natality, her counter concept to Heideggerian death, and in this dark, murky, illiberal place of violence, you're allowed to have secrets and grow up, and before you have to come out into the public sphere and be, rinsed of your violence and be a nice, sanitary, liberal individual. So for Arendt, she, for most of her work, she's famous for the public sphere, the oikos, the boredom, the yuck, the violence. It's a terrible place. And suddenly, when I'm looking for texts on privacy for undergraduate CS majors, I got this text to say, is this what we think about privacy? Is this the thing we need to preserve that dark space. Is this a condition of possibility for a just world of 100% surveillance? And the reason why I ask this is because East Germany, for example, killed both the private sphere and the public sphere. And do we live in a world that is close to the Stasi that way? Where you have a completely polluted public sphere and you can't go and have beer with your friends, or you can't go home to your partner and not be recorded. And that's what I ask my students. I'm not convinced that her condition of possibility for justice in that dark natality notion of privacy, I'm not convinced this is going to save us. It's a thought experiment.
I want to, I'm curious about this question of privacy, because both your and the private, both your talks kind of surround this. I just want to say two very short things. That is, I remember that Arendt essay, the thing that was quite bothered by all this business about authority, and she makes one wonderful argument, for me at least, and that is that the kids should not decide for themselves their curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because, well, I mean, ostensibly because you need authority to decide, you know, and, but she also makes the kind of Beelzebub. What's the name?
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies.
Yes, she does.
Flies kind of argument. If you allow kids to take care of their own business, well, they will take care of their own business. It's quite a cruel scene, and I think that notion, and that is something that I could relate to immediately, because
Sure.
That notion kind of addressed the entire, not the entire, but at least it gave some substance to these notions of authority, which she talks about in the essay. So I thought to your questions and the question you raised, I think this is, for me at least, when I read the argument, I'm not saying this is a substantial one, but for me it was an interesting place to plunge.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I think that's right. Authority for her is a good word. She defends authority in a number of places, and authority is, she means it in the kind of Socratic authority, that I, as your enlightener, am here to take you out of the cave. But when she's talking about children left to their own devices, she's talking about that oikos, the private sphere of violence, the same thing that she wants to preserve, because this is where we create ourselves. So I think she's typically incoherent, because she's always incoherent. I mean, this is who Arendt is. So on the one hand, we shouldn't leave children to their devices. On the other hand, the private sphere is that Lord of the Flies, awful, violent home space.
I don't know if I agree, but you can figure it out.
I'm thinking it's human condition and what she's thinking about.
So, and I think both of you, it was very interesting to listen to you together, but I have two separate questions. So, first of all, for you, we've talked a lot about narratives, and I'm curious about the way you perceive, with your experience and talking to students and thinking about the issue yourself, the case of Edward Snowden, and the kind of narrative we have around him as a kind of cultural icon, cultural hero, Citizen 4 being, sort of a prime example. So you bring technology in, and how do you perceive, what are your thoughts about the ways in which we create new narratives around these borderlines where technology kind of applies in
Okay. It was funny, I was trying to decide what to give for this conference. I just wrote a piece on Edward Snowden as Socrates. I went to a conference and I interviewed him, and along with a lot of other people who interviewed him. He's got a spiel down. It's a very slick spiel of who he is and what he's doing and what his project is, and why he's a patriot. And so his narrative is really interesting. The student fandom of Snowden is really interesting. He is as a Twitter phenomenon is interesting.
Say more about that as a Twitter phenomenon.
Oh, I follow him. I tweet to him. I follow his lawyer. He's absolutely a celebrity. And I talked to his lawyer and I said, does he get paid for these appearances? Yes, as a matter of fact, he has the same agency that handles stars and politicians and Bill Clinton and everybody else. Oh, he doesn't, but he speaks free to students. I'm sorry, I didn't want to be taking every time. But anyway, so that Edward Snowden phenomenon is a strange one. It doesn't answer our problem of what is justice in a world of total surveillance. His answer is blow up your government and run off to Russia, and that's not an option for me or my students or with debt and who are in college hoping to go somewhere in life. Not everybody can be Snowden, and this is what I asked him. His answers are end-to-end encryption and all those sorts of things, but I didn't want to bore anyone with that. Those kinds of technical discussions. One of the things that I think he's right about, and Arendt is probably not terribly interested in, is that privacy shouldn't just be for the elite. That privacy should be for the person on the street with his or her own phone or whatever. That people should have the same tools to encrypt and to gain privacy as the elite have. The last thing I want to say about privacy is if looking at the moral foundations of privacy, the philosophical text is easy, but when you look at the legal cases for privacy, it's a mess in America. It's a mess. It's a very tricky subject to talk about. And at the end of the day, almost all privacy philosophers defer to the legal mess that we have. Privacy is a foggy concept.
Mm-hmm.
What's messy in Europe? A quick question to Keren. So, in your larger projects and sort of broader thoughts, what do you make of this explosion of the post-catastrophic, at the end time scenarios we're flooded with, both in literature but also in popular culture, from the zombies to the road?
To the man in the high castle.
To the man. Well, the man in the high castle, I think, has a lot to do with just general nostalgia. I mean, everyone's just looking for things to remake, and that's just the next best thing.
Really? So, it's not post 9/11?
It probably is. I haven't seen it. But the post-apocalypse. I mean, I think this has to do with a general culture of crisis, and I think this is, again, it's signaled kind of metonymically by 9/11, but I think it has a lot to do with technology and the sense of the loss of an individual, and the sense of the failure of the nation state, and I meant to say the loss of the privacy, but the complication of the individual and so on. And so there's this mode that the categories with which we have lived comfortably, at least ethically comfortably, for such a long time, have been really shaken to the ground, and so it's all a catastrophe, and we've got really cool technology and we can show fancy explosions on cinema and things. I think that has a lot to do with it, and I think that it has to do with a culture of sensationalism. I mean, we know this argument, we've gotten so immune to subtlety in popular culture. Things are just getting bigger and louder and bigger and louder, and and then there's a third film, and then there's a prequel, and then there's a prequel to the prequel, and then then there's a trailer to the preview of the prequel to the. It just gets this, it's all a sensation, and I just watched The Bicycle Thief or Thieves, and it's just so subtle and quiet and painful and gorgeous that I kind of miss that. But with The Road, you get something like that. You get this just quiet, this really painful journey, and I think that's the kind of attempt to not to go back to an Eden, but to recognize that we have to reinvent where we come from, because we don't believe that story anymore. This organic teleology of it all began in a good place and it will end in a good place. We have to find a place we are comfortable with constructing and moving on from, and forming a community and paying the price and being accountable and writing good novels.
Cheer for that.
If there is, I think that we started a little late, so there is maybe time for one more question, if there is.
Can I just make one comment? My students didn't get the bicycle thief at all, right? So for you, it was the individual, this thing, this basic need to just. And about what you said about Silicon Valley, the remark was, why can't he just get a bike? What's the big deal? Just steal one, just make something, just figure it out.
Order it from Uber. What's the problem?
Yeah, just
Isn't
figure
there
something
Uber
out.
bikes?
This can't be such a terrible problem. It's just a stupid bike. And I found that kind of reflecting on both your talks is phenomenal. Inability to sense the urgency of the symbol of this bicycle. This just inability to see in the bicycle a symbol to some kind of greater concern about individuality and decency and kind of.
Also, there are not many bikes back then. There are not many bikes back in 1948.
Well, but in the film there are.
Yeah.
Well, mobility in general, right?
Yeah.
It's become
Okay, so we should move.
Another question?
Okay, so.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.